Would you believe me if I told you this was the second time I was recording this? Got to press record. Anyway, let's just get right into it. New setup. Yes, I know. I needed some light, so I just had to use this spare bedroom upstairs, and now I'm a little happier. Got some sunlight. But that's not what we're talking about today. What we are talking about is B-roll in music videos, because man, I have seen many music videos that do not have any B-roll. The first thing I think is, this must be an amateur. And if that's you, don't feel offended, because that's why you're here. We're gonna fix that. On your very next music video, you're gonna start shooting some B-roll. And these are the tips that you're gonna follow. So let's get started. Roll that intro. So the first tip is using B-roll to establish new locations and characters. So when you're telling a story, adding in establishers helps to set the tone for where the action is actually happening. Establishers help to introduce new characters, new locations, or even effects. Consider using establishers as B-roll when you're shooting things like story-driven music videos. So let's give some more practical advice. Every time I walk into a new location, even if I've scouted it before, I just look around for anything interesting. I try to get some wide shots with my wide angle, and then I'll focus in a little bit on some details. So I look for things like how the light's hitting certain things in certain areas, and I just try to find some details that I think are really interesting and that might help to sell the story just a little bit more. I don't spend too much time on this. It's usually about like 15 minutes to maybe half an hour, but I try to not be much of a perfectionist on this. Like, I'm not setting this up for lighting or anything. I'm just trying to get the location as a whole and then trying to get the details as just focused in as possible. I tend to heavily stylize these things because I find that's an easier way to set the tone for the music video as a whole. Tip number 2 is adding more dynamics with some slow motion shots. So following along on the shoot, after I get all my lights set up and I'm ready to start going, I'll start shooting some performances at a regular 24 frames. And as I'm shooting those performances, I'm keeping an eye on some certain things that the artist is doing that I really like. After I'm seeing those things and I'm watching how they move, and I'm making a little list in my head about things that I maybe want to isolate that we can throw in there into the edit. Sometimes I'm thinking if I'm really liking the location, I'll just shoot a whole performance take at 60 frames so I can slow any parts down as well. And this is only if you have enough time. I will also capture a lot of the establisher B-roll in this frame rate, because then I can slow it down in post if I need to. I find played back at 24 frames, a lot of the times people don't notice because they're just very short clips, or again, they're heavily stylized and affected. Occasionally I'll shoot slow motion like 120 frames. There's some things that are really cool, like drum cymbals or like explosions, water, that kind of thing. Those are always really sweet to see in super slow motion. So I save those things and just try to isolate shots like that. Don't be afraid to experiment here. You're gonna just find things that really look cool when they're in slow motion. Tip number 3 is probably the reason why I use B-roll the most. And it's because it's literally saved my edits. It saved entire edits because I had B-roll to cover up parts that I needed to cover up. So I know firsthand, this has happened to me multiple times, whether it's the artist or the camera operator, there are some clips that you just don't want anybody to see. Yeah. Oh, my gimbal did the same thing as you did. And sometimes I even see people use this in their final edits. Man, this is embarrassing. You do not want to do this kind of stuff. So let's, from this day forward, start shooting some B-roll so you don't have to put those sloppy performances or the sloppy camera work. You don't have to put that stuff in there anymore. Now we can use B-roll. So when you're shooting B-roll, you can always shoot little parts that don't need to go with the performances, but then you could also shoot pieces that follow the song to a T. For example, if someone says something like Nike's on my feet, you might be able to get away with just literally showing Nikes on their feet. I mean, it could be kind of cheesy, but it could work. You never know. So just shoot the B-roll and then you have it if you need it. So tip number 4 for why B-roll is great is because it helps to focus on other parts that aren't the performance. So when you add B-roll into the edit, it gives the audience a break from just watching the performances. This might also save you from having to shoot too many performances. I know from experience that locations are limited, especially when you're shooting things like bands, because the setup times take forever and then you can't just always be loud everywhere. So you tend to get shut down pretty quick. So having that extra story or B-roll element means that you might need less locations or less time at those locations because you can shoot B-roll that helps fill up those gaps instead. Tip number 5 is it allows you to get away with a little bit of those fancier effects. Performance shots are meant to be entertaining on their own, and if you get the same effects happening over the exact same performance shots, it tends to just get really monotonous. But then when you add those same effects to B-roll, it helps just add a little more spice, a little more interest, and you can get away with a lot more. So you can slap a bunch of different effects on this B-roll because they're only going to see that clip once, or at least they should. I hope you're not using the exact same clip multiple times. Unless there's a real reason for it, yeah, don't do that. I use the heavy effects on my B-roll because it helps to cover up my little imperfections. I don't care nearly as much about perfectly exposed images or things perfectly in focus. Sometimes I'll even take B-roll that I shot and just take the part that I normally would throw out. I'm usually trying to be a little bit more artsy, a little bit more unique, trying to shoot things from different angles on different focal lengths that don't really make sense. When I get to the edit, I usually try to get really creative with these things, and the effects really help. I'm usually adding things like film grain, film burn, lens flares, stutters, glitch effects, flashes, just all these little spices in my spice rack. Try using a few of these things and maybe stacking them on top of each other. So just slap a bunch of these effects on top of your B-roll and no one will notice that you shot with the lens cap on. Okay, so that just about wraps that up. I really hope this video helped you to get some better B-roll for your next music video. And please, don't be that guy who doesn't shoot B-roll. Really, at this point, you have no excuse. So if you're gonna start shooting B-roll for your music videos, tap that like button and subscribe if you feel so inclined. My name's Ciprian. I'll catch you guys in the next one.